Thank you so much for sharing this space with us. We are so honored to be here with you today. Today we'll be sharing a little bit from our latest step of our trauma-informed services toolkit that explores cultural humility in trauma-informed services, and we'll be exploring different strategies and resources to help a practitioner be developing a practice to ongoingly audit their implicit bias and to provide more culturally humble legal support to unaccompanied children. My name is Janaki Sanyal. I go by she, her pronouns. I am a senior program associate with Acacia's Unaccompanied Children program, where I work to provide holistic resources to assist network practitioners in delivering client-centered, culturally humble, and trauma-informed support. My background is in clinical social work, and I have worked with young people and families for over 10 years. Building an abolitionist approach to mental health and trauma work that centers the impact of legacies of colonialism and migration experiences.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elle Gagny. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a program analyst, also with Acacia's Unaccompanied Children program. My background is in organizing to end mass incarceration and providing emergency services for displaced people, all of which has informed my abolitionist approach to our work. At Acacia, my work focuses specifically on equipping legal service providers to provide trauma-informed, culturally humble support, as well as research on burnout, gendered labor, and bureaucratic pathology.
All right, so we're gonna start with a question. If you will either scan the QR code or you can also join at slido.com, entering the number on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. We just want to get a quick check to see what are some ways, big and small, that you practice cultural humility in your work with young people. We'll give you about a minute to share some of your responses, get yourselves connected, and then we'll read them out and share. If you are just joining this moment, we are getting connected on Slido and sharing what are some of our own personal best practices, what are the ways that we practice cultural humility in our work with children. Make fewer assumptions, keep an open mind, sharing my immigrant story. Ooh, these are coming in fast. Give them the power when I interview them. I listen and understand. Emphasizing that they are the boss. Self-reflection. I don't assume that they speak a certain language. Inclusion, being a good listener. Not assuming cultural norms apply to all clients, asking specifically about their life. Ask them to teach me something. Great responses. These are great. Language appropriate responses. Listening and understanding, being empathetic. Being an active listener, listening and not judging. These are great. We can see the ways that everyone in this line of work, we are so committed and are really being creative and strategic in the ways that we help children feel seen and have space to be their authentic selves. Try to consider things from a different perspective. Asking for an interpreter of the same gender when asking sensitive questions. These are great ideas, and just really shows us how much we use this muscle, how much we use this tool as a key part of our professional approach. And these are key tools from our toolboxes that we use often and need to keep updated. Even those who are just starting out or those who have been in our careers for a little while, this is a muscle we want to keep exercising. And we know that young people, when they're working with us, they're having to share these really difficult stories with adults while feeling in this very vulnerable place in their lives, and they're navigating, a traumatic legal process. And so I just want to share this all together in this space. It's so evident how we share this commitment to making this process as healing-centered as possible. And I'm just so glad to be together and strategizing together how to, continue building in that direction. So as we move forward, thank you so much for sharing your responses. We will, explore the basics of implicit bias and where that intersects with privilege and legal support services. And explore different kind of strategies and approaches to create a lifelong professional practice of ongoingly auditing our own implicit biases because, they evolve as we evolve, and building tools for building a more culturally humble and anti-oppressive practice. My heart is also full reading all those responses. It was great. All right. So in this section, we'll move forward. We will begin by establishing a shared understanding of what implicit bias is and how to identify it within ourselves. And then we'll further explore how it shows up in our everyday work, providing legal support services to unaccompanied children and their families. So to start out, I'd like to invite you to do this self-reflection activity. Auditing our own implicit bias towards the goal of creating a more culturally humble practice begins with building an evolving awareness of our own intersecting cultural identities, right? And the privileges that come with them. These are not stationary parts of our identity that we might have learned in our youth or in the college or in our early stages of our careers. And we've completed this process of learning about ourselves. This is really a moving target that changes with time, depending on our environment and so many different factors. And, our understanding of our own identities really becomes increasingly nuanced as we grow older and more wise. So here on the screen, you can see the intersecting axes of privilege, domination, and oppression adapted from KP Morgan's graphic. And I do want to make a note that while it covers many identities, it does not cover all, but can be used as a helpful tool to recognize and identify your own privileged identities. So the center line is labeled domination, and all identities above that line are those that are known as privileged identities, and identities below that line are known as historically oppressed and marginalized identities. And each is on an axis, one part above the line and one part below the line. So I'd like you all to take a moment to identify your intersecting identities. Some will be above the line, some will be below the line. We all live at the intersection of multiple intersecting identities that describe who we are, right? And our privileged identities are the ones that show us where our blind spots are that we bring to our practice, because, the nature of privileged is that we are often blind to that privilege, right? And it requires intentional and ongoing work to be aware of it. So these are the areas that we want to be focusing our audits. So take a moment to identify. You can name, you can write it down, your privileged identities, and then we'll be reflecting as we move through this presentation just on how our privilege shows up in our practice. And I just want you to think about cultural competence and humility and what that means to you and what you're hoping to learn and expand on and improve in your practice.
So to understand the impact of implicit bias and how it shows up in our work, we need to start by exploring our own cultural identity and our beliefs in order to develop an awareness of how our privilege and our biases might impact a child's sense of safety. This requires approaching cultural differences as a learner, which means understanding that in order to communicate and gather information, in order to advocate effectively and identify eligibility for relief, and in order to maximize a young person's agency throughout the entire process, we need to understand the role of their culture in their identity, behavior, worldview, and as well as how social perceptions about their culture and identity could impact their eligibility. So a couple of things that we want to keep in mind about culture and privilege are first that objective culture is observable. So this will be things like traditions, food, music, or clothing. Meanwhile, subjective culture is invisible. It is our lens. It lives in our minds, our values, our attitudes, and our beliefs. It is the logic by which we give order to the world. And although it is often invisible, we are dependent on subjective culture because it creates the lens through which we see, understand, and interpret everything around us, which means that we are attributing culturally based meaning to things without necessarily being aware of it. And through our cultural lens, we make judgments on things like whether a person is being truthful, whether they're being rude or manipulative, intelligent or superstitious. All of this is based on assumptions that we make about the meaning of their behavior. And while with different cultural lenses, lawyers and clients may attribute completely different meanings to the same sets of facts or behaviors. And this often results in similarly situated clients winding up with drastically different case outcomes. With our cultural lenses, we also perceive our own cultures and identities and privileges that come with it very differently. Because privilege is not automatic. It is automatic, but it is not elected, chosen, or earned. Privilege can also be adjacent. So while many of us feel very informed about our privileged identities, the blinders that privilege creates to obscure itself are never fully removed. Rather, it's an ongoing process of self-reflection that is never fully resolved, and it requires ongoing, continuous practice to understand and unpack. Implicit bias is prejudicial negative feelings or beliefs about a group without being aware of that bias. It is a reflection of these subtle cognitive processes influenced by our experiences, our cultural lenses, and our upbringings. Implicit bias operates at a level below our conscious awareness, meaning that it can often function without intent and predict our behaviors even more so than our conscious values. Because implicit bias is present in our judgment, it affects our professional decisions and actions in multifaceted ways. Among attorneys, implicit bias has been found to be interconnected with large caseloads, overwhelm, and burnout. It can emerge as a response to stress. So, for example, when faced with an overwhelming caseload and inadequate resources, a practitioner might rely on culturally based assumptions to triage and decide where attention and effort is most deserved. Implicit racial bias can also create a shortcoming for an overwhelmed practitioner to make decisions more efficiently by filtering information or filling in missing data with assumptions and categorizing people according to cultural stereotypes. This can manifest in a variety of different implicit biases impacting our decision making, including biases about immigration status, urban or rural backgrounds, gender expression, religion, family size and composition, standards of beauty, and even names.
So implicit bias affects judgments, even if we as practitioners are committed to zealous advocacy and consciously and genuinely rejecting negative stereotypes and attitudes about marginalized population. It still affects our practice and all facets of our practice. And it impacts the children that we work with in various ways, including the ways that we use language in our case notes, in our inter-colleague communications, the ways that we frame behavioral observations, the use of strengths-based versus deficit-based language. It can influence misinterpretations and criminalization of client behaviors and expressions of stress and trauma, which can lead to an increase in things like significant incident reports or transfer of facilities, all of which can really have a big impact on their case. Implicit bias can preclude certain groups from accessing service or lead to improper or culturally incompetent treatment, inadequate support, ineffective case management, disconnections from care. It can lead to overrepresentation in child welfare and criminal justice systems, and ultimately has a chilling effect that prevents help seekers from pursuing and accessing services. And for the young people that we work with, most of whom have been impacted by trauma, it affects their ability and their right to feel safe.
So we're going to take another moment for self-reflection here. We'd like you to ask yourself how your practice changes when you sense that a client is being dishonest, or when you feel as though they may not like you or appreciate your support due to your race, your gender, your appearance, or their own implicit bias. And we're going to share what comes up as you reflect on these questions in another Slido. So take a moment and put some of your takeaways here. Interesting. Ask me a lot more questions. Yeah, having not experienced this yet. We'll talk about that a bit more later. Giving space and time if you sense a client might be being dishonest. Just circle back and talk later, given that pause and that agency. Asking how they're feeling, checking in, giving them the space to share how they're doing, and to find some common ground and discussing something more lighthearted. Wondering if it's because you're not feeling them safe, making them feel safe or comfortable. Hear about discrepancies without judgment, changing your interviewing. Taking advantage of, asking about their goals and reminding benefit. Focus on building rapport, taking that pause, maybe stopping entirely and building that relationship. Changing to a lighter topic for a while. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of circling back, giving space and trying to build rapport, and a lot of self-reflection. Take a second, check my feelings. Yeah, I think with a lot of these responses, it can be really helpful to reflect more on where the feelings are coming from. And in this next section, we're going to examine how to disrupt implicit bias within ourselves and how we can approach situations in which a client or even our organizations might be operating based on implicit bias. And then we're going to dig deeper into some of the tools that are available to guide your self-reflection and your subsequent practice. So thank you so much for these responses. These are really interesting and very reflective.
So how do we disrupt implicit bias? There are three elements needed to disrupt implicit bias in practice. The first is cultural competence, or the ability to appreciate, understand, and interact with people from different backgrounds, cultures, and belief systems as yours. An incumbent in that is also cultural humility, which is the ongoing self-reflection about your privileges and biases alongside critical and honest assessment of your own practice. The second is cultural responsiveness and accessibility, which entails prioritizing language access and culturally responsive, trauma-informed communication when working with unaccompanied children and their families. This maximizes client safety and comprehension. It furthers their agency and in the processes that are affecting their lives, and also restores a sense of control where trauma can really take away a sense of control and leave a sense of vulnerability. And cultural responsiveness means, using a strengths-based lens at all times that recognizes the child's and the family's expertise, their knowledge, their cultural capital, and their tools. And then finally, there's anti-oppressive practice, which refers to our ongoing effort to learn and incorporate strategies for intentionally constructing power differently and approaching our work in a way that addresses systemic inequities. Anti-oppressive practice operates on both individual and institutional levels, and it entails practicing in a way that is always aware of inequity and bias and seeks to address it by intentionally implementing strategies that disrupt oppression rather than reproduce it.
Let's begin with a primer on cultural competency and cultural humility and why both are needed in our work with unaccompanied children. Cultural competency begins as a deep respect for cultural differences and an eagerness to learn about different ways of viewing the world. But it can sometimes lead to harmful stereotyping or generalizations. Meanwhile, cultural humility focuses on the lifelong practice of learning about those cultural differences. It requires an acknowledgement that learning is never done, as well as ongoing critical self-assessment of practice with the intent to be recurrently auditing for implicit biases. Cultural humility understands the complexity of intersecting identities and acknowledges that even in all our similarities, there is difference, because no one person can ever be fully confident about the evolving nature of another's experiences. Cultural humility also means being very intentional about disrupting systems of oppression. It requires the institutional practices of auditing for implicit bias. It also requires enacting systems of accountability and creating intentional language and strategies that mitigate power imbalances at the organizational level. Both cultural competency and cultural humility are required to provide the most effective trauma-informed support for our clients. And if, as practitioners, we are open to lifelong processes of auditing our own privileges and biases, while engaging with deep respect and curiosity with different cultures, then the depth of our knowledge and therefore our representation will only become more nuanced, person-centered, intersectional, and accurate as time goes on.
Hogan's personal competencies are a useful framework when self-assessing for the skills needed to be culturally humble and to create trauma-informed spaces that model respect and healthy communication with the young people we're working with. The key skills are, number one, the ability to articulate one's perspective respectfully and clearly, while also intentionally creating safe space for disagreement and feedback from the young person. Then demonstrating that their perspective and feedback has value by enacting systems for incorporating that feedback into your practice. Number two is the ability to question one's own perspective, the ability to be wrong, to know that there are other realities outside of your own and other expertise outside of your own that are equally important and essential in the legal process. Number three is the ability to be aware of one's own biases, as we've been discussing. Number four is the ability to ongoingly question and manage those biases and stereotypes. Are you implementing systems to be regularly assessing and interrogating those biases? Are you prioritizing this as an essential and recurring part of your professional development? And number five is the ability to personalize your observations and rephrase using I statements. And this one really includes just following the trauma-informed tenets in the language you use across the board. Things like seeing and naming strengths first and consistently, centering the client's expertise and skills, and generally never speaking about a person's expressions of trauma without naming the environmental and systemic stressors that person experienced, and the strengths and capacities that person developed to survive.
So in this graphic, you can see how those skills that Jonathan just mentioned might play out in real time in an interaction with a young person. Each element of this graphic becomes part of a simple assessment system that you can use to check in with yourself, to assess how an interaction or a relationship is going, and to set goals for what you aim to bring to the table every single time you meet, with an intention of creating a culturally humble and trauma-informed space for your client. This framework aims to itemize and quantify the behaviors needed for a healthy relationship through dialogue, conflict, recovery, and problem solving. And it can be applied across all kinds of relationships, not just client-attorney relationships. So using this as an assessment tool, you can rate yourself on each of the 14 competencies by asking yourself, am I having patience and listening carefully? Am I observing attentively and assuming complex intersectional identities? Am I being flexible, sharing personal observations, and being resourceful? Am I having a sense of humor and tolerating ambiguity and uncertainty? Am I displaying empathy? Am I managing my personal bias and stereotypes? Am I being non-judgmental? And am I paying attention to my own feelings throughout this process? On the next slide, we're going to, and on the handouts that we also share after this presentation, we'll overview instructions on how to use these parameters in order to conduct your own self-assessment and to see where you're landing in these areas. So this is the slide that would be shared on your handout, and it should be used in conjunction with the questions from the last slide. For example, if you're very good about having patience or listening carefully, then you would rate yourself a 4 or a 5 in that area. And if those are areas where you could use some improvement, maybe you'd rate yourself a 1 or a 2. And this is a great tool to recurrently assess your interactions with clients. And as with all of the self-assessment resources that we share in this presentation and your handouts, we encourage you to approach your results with a growth mindset rather than shaming yourself for areas that might require some extra attention. Auditing your own implicit biases is a lifelong process that will always present opportunities to learn and grow. And getting caught up in shame or discomfort is only going to take attention away from that important work.
So how do we turn self-reflection into responsive and accessible practice? Well, we can start with these 3 pillars. As we touched on in the previous section, we start with exploring what we learn when we regularly use assessment tools and design professional development systems to audit for implicit bias in our practice and in our client-provider relationships. We imagine systems where similar auditing tools might be scaled up to build anti-bias and anti-oppressive policies and practices at organizational levels. Next, cultural and linguistic responsiveness and accessibility is the next key element in building cultural humility into legal service provision. And that is, many of us know that as practitioners, we ourselves have observed how language access can be overlooked at multiple points in the immigration process and can have catastrophic consequences. And then we can follow those breadcrumbs to connect how those two pillars lead to the third, how systems to audit for implicit bias and assess for cultural responsiveness and linguistic accessibility are inextricably linked to trauma-informed legal services. And we can easily see how when implicit bias is not examined, when language access is not prioritized, how much more violent and re-traumatizing the whole process then can be for a child, making safe spaces impossible to create, information impossible to access, and communication, consent, and self-advocacy then impossible to achieve.
So implicit bias impacts key areas of our service delivery, namely our understanding, our actions, and our decisions on all fronts. Because implicit bias predicts our behavior more so even than our conscious values, we know that no matter how committed we are to social justice and zealous advocacy, implicit bias is still present and it still impacts our daily practice. We've learned that implicit bias thrives in situations where practitioners must make quick decisions with imperfect information, especially when those practitioners are exhausted, under-resourced, overstimulated, anxious, or stressed. And so we make professional decisions that impact clients based on our perceptions during interviews and assessments under these circumstances. And this can include our interpretation of body language, interpersonal dynamics, and intimate family relationships in those assessments. This requires bringing together collateral information, taking into account historical context, and then applying what we have learned through our own personal cultural lenses about human behavior and communication, family dynamics, abuse, violence, substance use, and a variety of other factors. And because implicit bias impacts these personal cultural lenses, including how we understand nonverbal cues and signals in communication, how we can interpret body language, and how we judge character and intent, implicit bias has a significant impact on our ability to accurately attribute meaning to client behaviors. In our relationships, both with clients and colleagues, implicit bias impacts how we build trust and rapport, which are the two tenets of creating trauma-informed spaces and relationships. And this in turn can make it difficult to proceed with the honesty and the trust that are needed to adeptly solve problems that arise throughout the lifespan of a case.
In this slide, I would love to shout out one of our favorite resources, which is Sela's Guide on Cultural Competency and Humility when Representing Unaccompanied Children. This is an extremely helpful resource that you can find linked in our shared resources attachment that really helped to illustrate how cultural humility and competency are these essential tenets to effective representation. It reminds us how prioritizing cultural humility makes us better advocates for our clients for so many reasons, partially because, as we keep returning to this key part, that this is an essential part of trauma-informed interviewing. It helps traumatized children to feel safe while assessing for eligibility requirements that require them to share this very personal information. And culturally humble legal support allows them to build enough trust to communicate freely as their authentic selves and share their whole identity and whole story, and therefore helps us to obtain more accurate information to better determine their interests and more accurately represent their case to an adjudicator. We know also that cultural humility is an ethical and moral obligation, right? It's an expectation of the rules of professional conduct that require a practitioner to provide competent and diligent representation, which is all a part of acting with commitment to the interest and the well-being and the safety of the client, and in providing person-centered, zealous representation and advocacy on the client's behalf.
So as you begin this next chapter of your self-awareness and this professional development, there are a couple of tools that can help you establish a baseline and point you in the right direction. These links will also be shared with the slides afterwards and in the handout for you to keep and return to throughout your practice. For assessing your own implicit biases, we recommend the implicit association test and the reflective experience tool from Carrie Fisher's 7E model for cultural humility and anti-oppressive leadership, which has post-interaction reflection prompts that can also be shared in a handout form. And if you're looking to connect with colleagues and to learn about the shared challenges that you have together, if you're also looking to learn about best resources and best practices, we recommend joining Sela's Social Services Working Group and the Listserv, or Acacia's monthly UCP Ask a Social Worker office hours, which Jonaki hosts. And when you're digging into organizational bias assessment, the cultural humility cards and diversity and inclusion assessments can be customized to shape your assessment and inform how you proceed with disrupting how implicit bias impacts your organizational structures and function. Finally, a reading recommendation and some food for thought. Lawyering from a Deportation Abolition Ethic by Layla Haas is an excellent read that we have both really enjoyed.
So now we're going to talk about cultural responsiveness and linguistic accessibility and how we can incorporate that into practice, which can mean evolving these assessment systems to incorporate ways to regularly audit how language access needs are being understood and met. For example, Indigenous language speakers or children with disabilities such as blindness or deafness who have experienced bias and discrimination or may feel invisibilized in predominantly Spanish-speaking spaces, or may be reluctant to speak up or ask for help or express confusion. Or for example, practitioners working with deaf and blind children who may not have received all of the needed resources to learn how to maximize language accessibility and the tools and accommodations that they're entitled to. So when we are imagining and building these auditing systems, we want to be intentional about, okay, centering the clients and families' expertise and creating equitable, collaborative teams with clients, families, and community as partners in identification of needs. We want to be seeking out different and new ways to learn more from Indigenous as well as disability justice advocates to actively build up our awareness of diversity of language and language access needs. And we want to be challenging ourselves to keep learning about the ways that worldview and therefore trauma-informed support are so tied to language. To illustrate, there are 70 Indigenous language families in Latin America, and within them, there are 364 Indigenous languages spoken in Mexico, 273 spoken in Central America, and 448 languages spoken in South America. In Cielo's Cultural Awareness webinar series, Odilia Romero reminds practitioners that each language reflects a different worldview, with so many different ways to communicate events, feelings, information, and nuanced undertones, so much of which is not translatable. So keeping this in mind, we want to be exploring best practices for working with interpreters and being sure to seek out non-English and non-Spanish speaking perspectives. And at the organizational level, it requires ongoing critical reflection of organizational consistency and commitment to accessibility in practice as well as policy. So that can mean utilizing or initiating systems to evaluate accessibility for the variety of needs that children will arrive with, and devising a plan for how to make gaps known. We want to be assessing, for example, as arrangements for interpreters can sometimes be delayed, asking what tools are we providing for communication in the meanwhile, and when a child's language access needs exceed the organization's scope, what does it do to accommodate and adjust in a timely manner? And then asking questions about how to incorporate this feedback on individual and organizational levels of practice and policy.
Centering the client's expertise and practice starts with remembering these grounding points. First, that the most effective social and mental health support comes from those with shared experiences, cultures, and communities. And second, that we position ourselves, the practitioners, as students, partners, and facilitators. What this means in practice is that we listen more and we talk less. We validate their feelings and experiences and convey that they are believed and supported. It means anticipating the nuance and complexity of multiple intersecting identities and placing ongoing emphasis on the child and family's expertise on their experiences, identities, and cultures. It also requires flattening the power hierarchy, which is a step that is important to incorporate in the early stages of relationship building with a young person. Naming that you are different than an authority figure, that both you and your client have expertise that is essential and deeply needed, and emphasizing that the two of you are collaborators and a team. To maximize a young person's agency and engagement, we want to remember that processes and structures need to be co-created with young people. That means prioritizing their involvement in planning and creating meaningful roles for their participation. Plan with them rather than for them. Jointly develop meeting agendas and service plans, and be intentional about creating space for disagreement and feedback. Then make sure that you also take sincere follow-up actions to demonstrate how you're incorporating their feedback. When working with children impacted by trauma, we keep the mantra "Move at the Speed of Trust" by Adrienne Marie Brown always at the front of our minds. The speed of trust means slowing down, trusting the child to set their own pace, and taking the time to build and learn about them, prioritizing choice and transparency at every level of the process. Moving at the speed of trust also requires understanding that safety is defined by the child, and that providing trauma-informed, healing-centered support does not require the actual disclosure of trauma. We want to respect the pace at which clients are willing to share their stories and not rush or push them for disclosure. They will let us know when they feel safe to share.
So language, we know the way that we use language is so powerful in building or breaking cultural humility and has the power to connect or distance, to lift someone up and make them feel seen, or to break their spirit and their trust, right? Take a look at this comic here. We are looking at a koala responding to traumatic circumstances in a stressful and toxic environment. And this guy over here says, this young koala has a mental health problem. So this is a little dark humor that is an example of the ways that we can ignore environmental and systemic oppression in the pathologizing language that's used when talking about young people's behaviors and expressions of trauma, and the additional harm that is created when we wield language in that way. So with our intention to engage in an encounter that will heal rather than harm, here are a couple of areas that we can turn our focus to. Self-assessment for use of trauma-informed and strength-based language in your communications, inter-colleague interactions, assessments, and interviews. Ongoingly asking if you are writing about interpretations of a child's behavior within the context of their environment, and bringing to the forefront the strengths and capacities they bring to the table, most especially the children who present as the most challenging to work with, require their strengths to be seen, even when they are not in the room. The next is interrogating pathologizing language, such as this comic, including when it is in existing documents or notes, or even in the form of a diagnosis. And remembering that the majority of children's mental health challenges that you will encounter are normal responses to oppressive circumstances and environments that cause ongoing trauma. They are not deficits or disorders that occur in a vacuum. The next we are, and I think that we share this in this room, that to learn a child's strengths means having to spend the time to learn those strengths, making time for play and curiosity, making time for chat and exploration of their interests, hobbies, and passions. When we are always searching for strengths to name, and when we search for them, we know that we find them everywhere, even in the most challenging of cases. So asking questions like, what are you an expert at? Or when you are doodling together before the meeting starts, making a comment like, whenever we doodle during our meetings, I notice how amazing of an artist you are. The next is using person-centered language, which is key. I've linked a helpful guide here that you'll be able to access when we share the slides. Next is using terms that signal respect and reinforce dignity, which is a reminder to get rid of the acronyms. No one wants to be an acronym. Using validating language when they share their challenges with us, and identifying coping strategies What helps you when you feel scared? Or what helped you survive that? Now, I want to acknowledge, I know that moving at the speed of trust forces us into this place of perpetual tension in this line of work. To push ourselves all the time to slow down, knowing how time-strapped we are and knowing that every minute counts towards this child's access to relief and support. This asks us to be ongoingly pushing ourselves to say, how can we make the time to move at the speed of trust? Where can we divest time to make time for this?
So here are some practical tips for building culturally humble spaces with children and prompts to assess for implicit bias in your reflections afterwards. We first recommend having a magic bag of mobile materials to help you create warm and inviting spaces when you're meeting with children in person. This can include culturally affirming and representative imagery or colorful art, as well as age-appropriate sensory materials to engage with and different communication modalities. When meeting virtually, we also recommend using some of the innovative skills developed by educators in the time of virtual learning. We've linked a tutorial to create virtual meeting spaces using Google Slides that are kid-friendly, interactive, warm, and inviting. We also recommend using culturally affirming tools like music, storytelling, and snacks if you're able to. And this can look like asking them to play you their favorite song or artist on YouTube and then playing their music in the background of your meeting. Use these tools as well to identify shared interests. For example, we've heard from a lot of providers that an appreciation for Bad Bunny seems to be a great cultural connector for many kids. We also recommend offering frequent breaks where you can play games that are familiar to them or allow them to take time to watch a short cartoon. Remember that there is safety in familiarity, so taking the time to build rapport through non-case related questions and prioritizing humor, play, and curiosity before business goes a long way in building trust. Finally, remember to position yourself as a learner and them as a teacher. Have them teach you something about where they came from or a word in their language.
So what about when you are the one picking up implicitly biased vibes? What are some strategies that you can use to call in others with care? So we know defensiveness and accusation will often result in closing the doors of communication and therefore extinguishing the opportunity for learning. So instead, when a colleague or client say something biased or prejudiced, here are a couple of ways that you can respond. Try the ouch approach, which sounds like, ouch, that is not landing well for me. You want to call attention to what someone has said, assume good intent, and name that it had an impact on you. You can ask clarifying questions like, this statement that you made, can you say more about that? Can you help me to understand? You can interrupt and redirect and name what you are noticing using the open the front door approach, where you would start with number one, stating what you observe. Number two, stating what you think, providing research, resources, or counter stories. Number three, stating what you feel. And number four, stating what you desire. So an example of the OT-FD communication might sound something like this. When speaking to a colleague, you might say, I noticed that you wrote the word superstitious when describing a client visiting a curandera instead of a doctor. You know, this is a common stereotype and might make someone feel uncomfortable or might make it more difficult for them to communicate with you. My approach is to avoid the word altogether. And really, if you ask open-ended questions about it and listen with curiosity, you're bound to learn a lot more about what she feels helps and why. And finally, if you do encounter defensiveness, this can often be bridged with acknowledgement and validation of feelings, which might sound something like this. I totally understand why you are feeling upset. I know it can be really complicated to talk through these things, and sometimes it brings up a lot of big emotions for me as well. Now, mistakes will be made, right? And we will sometimes be the ones to say the wrong thing. So we want to embark on this journey with forgiveness and patience for ourselves and others. We want to observe mistakes when they happen and learn from them. And as I like to consult Adrienne Marie Brown whenever I can, she said, quote, "Where you are wrong might be the most fertile ground for connecting with and receiving others." We need to be wrong. We need to make mistakes to grow. And the easier being wrong is for you, the faster you'll be able to release the constraints of your single viewpoint and learn more and connect more with others. So here are a couple strategies for when mistakes do occur. You want to begin with creating space for the person to share feedback and then accept that feedback without defensiveness. You're being called in, not called out, right? An example of this might sound something like, "Please let me know if I'm mispronouncing your name. I want to make sure I get it right." We want to get familiar with the essential components of a genuine apology. Remember that acknowledging intent is not the same as acknowledging impact. Expressing intent is really, that's kind of the easy part. It's easy to say, "Oh, I didn't mean to," but we know that falls short of taking full accountability, right? So acknowledging intent with impact sounds a little bit more like, "My intent was not to offend, but what I said was really offensive, and that's not okay. I'm sorry." We want to be careful not to insert a "but" anywhere. "I'm sorry, but I just didn't know," right? That's an attempt to justify or to explain away. And really, with genuine apologies, you don't explain or you justify. You just kind of acknowledge the impact and stop there. And then, you can express your genuine remorse and your plans for how you are going to do better next time. Doing things like correcting stereotypes out loud to show you are learning. A good start might be seeing things like, "Hold on, let me rewind. That did not come out right. Let me find the right language for this." And then just a gentle reminder that as we all approach this as learners and we are inviting correction, we still want to be aware that we don't put anyone in the position to do the labor of educating you. So it's why we do these self-assessments, and when we do our own work, we want to remember the mantra to forgive ourselves each night and recommit each morning by adjusting and making changes as we learn.
So the last tool set to disrupt implicit bias in ourselves and in our practice is honing in on anti-oppressive strategies. Anti-oppressive practice requires activism and advocacy, and it means actively challenging and changing oppressive structures and practices in both big and small ways. It requires intentional implementation of strategies that disrupt oppression rather than reproducing it, as well as effort and resources allocated towards learning and incorporating strategies to construct power in a way that addresses systemic inequity. Carrie Fisher's 7E model for cultural humility and anti-oppressive leadership, as we mentioned earlier, is a helpful guide that outlines categories of macro-resistance strategies that can be used to disrupt oppressive or racist policy and practice. So the first category is to interrogate, which involves strategies that focus on asking questions and gathering data to get conversations and collaboration started in an organization or in an agency. Category 2 is disruption, which includes strategies that center on interrupting the false information, accusations, and assumptions that result in ongoing oppressive policies, procedures, and practices. Finally, category 3 is to advocate and create, which includes strategies that are centered on action opportunities, such as raising awareness, voting, or participating in surveys, and levying privilege wherever possible. It asks that practitioners consider spearheading actions that cultivate anti-oppressive practices in the spaces where they work. And we'll be focusing today on how we can interrogate implicit bias in our organizations, disrupt how that implicit bias impacts the work that we do together, and how we can all use our talents and our skills to situate ourselves in a social change ecosystem to advocate for and create change.
So to challenge biases when we observe them in the systems that we are navigating, we have to be prepared to interrogate them and ask these really challenging questions to confront them. And this means asking why, as well as other challenging questions to seek clarity about language or actions when they are biased or problematic. Questions that push further than why does this work this way? And moving into what are we going to do to address this issue? By when? How? And who do I need to speak to? It means working to identify potential allies that are willing to ask those hard questions and seek out answers along with you. Connecting with individuals or groups that have been negatively impacted by those practices or policies and centering impacted voices when sharing the impact of that issue and gathering data. Using surveys, focus groups, and feedback loops to gather data on impact and input on accountability systems. And we have shared a couple of tools here in this presentation that we'll be sharing with you afterwards in the slides that we hope you will peruse. Just a couple of tools that are shared here that are helpful in giving some ideas to facilitate that organizational dialogue around roles in combating bias on multiple levels, such as the social change ecosystem map, our cultural humility cards, or the diversity and inclusion assessment.
So here are a couple of strategies that we can use when interrupting biased language or practice. We can first start by using words like stop, pause, wait a second, or please don't, which can all be effective conversation interrupters. And then we can follow that up by sharing relevant data for someone to consider a different perspective. This sounds like, actually, did you know, or have you seen, heard, read, or watched? This is also where we can provide correction for dated, stereotypical, or inappropriate language, or even make a powerful interruption by simply refusing to participate any further. Finally, when we're meeting with power players and we're communicating, we want to be aware of our own privilege and use it to make space and elevate the voices of those most impacted. And we can do that by passing them the mic.
Now, in closing, I would love to share this social change ecosystem framework here by Deepa Iyer. This is a really cool tool and framework to help you to explore and identify your role in the social change you want to see, the creation of more equitable systems that you want to be a part of, and in your commitment to solidarity, justice, and equity. You'll see the shared values in the center, the yellow circle at the center, and surrounding it, the 10 roles that people and organizations can embody when they bring their strengths and skill sets to social change efforts. The framework is premised on an ecosystem concept that we are all more effective and sustainable in social change work when we connect, we build networks, and identify our roles based on our authentic selves and our existing skills and strengths. So I want to give you all just a moment to explore what is your social change role. Are you a disruptor, a caregiver, a healer, a builder, or a guide? We'll give you a minute and ask that you reflect on your values, your strengths, and your role in your ecosystem. And then on the next slide, we'll ask you to share your intentions for your role in disrupting implicit bias and building more equitable organizational practices and a more culturally humble, trauma-informed, and anti-oppressive approach to this challenging work.
So here we'd like to begin connecting and brainstorming. Please share with us what your role is in the social change ecosystem map, as well as one intention for how you will use your skills, talents, and your social change role to disrupt implicit bias in your professional space. We're very excited to see what you guys have to say about this.
I already see in the comments a caregiver and a nurturer and a healer. And I love to hear how people situate themselves within these roles because it asks us to really look at our authentic selves, what we bring to our work outside of our professional skills. It's just beautiful hearing these roles and taking on these names. Yes, we've got a disruptor. Nice. A caregiver.
Yeah, and a caregiver. I love that we already have so many of the different roles set out. There's so much variety already.
In the chats, I see as a Shawnee Osage, I was taught well to take care. I'm feeling this in my heart, y'all. It's great to see these. Just to see us finding our places, storyteller and healer. Now, feel free to share your intentions, how you can, well, let me pull this up over here. Weaver, we see through lines of connectivity between people, places, organizations, ideas, and movements. So to me, someone asked, can you define Weaver? To me, that sounds like a connector. It sounds like somebody who is able to say this struggle and this struggle is interconnected. These are the ways that our liberation struggles, for example, might be connected, or these are the ways that these two organizations are either building on strengths or sharing best practices. I think there are a lot of different ways to interpret the Weaver. I see Weaver continue to stay positive for the client, all while connecting them with the resources around them and finding that support system. There we go. That's another Weaver, a connector.
Looks like we have one or two people still wrapping up, but it's really beautiful to see such a wide range of roles and ideas for how we can kind of move forward and disrupt these systems. And I think if you're having trouble kind of finding your role or brainstorming how you might be able to leverage your role to create change, take a moment to look at some of the creative examples here. If someone posted in the chat and you think that they have a similar role to yours, feel free to reach out and talk to them and brainstorm about how you could each personally implement these ideas for yourself or for your organization. And with that, we are looking forward to hearing more from all of you about your takeaways from this presentation. Thank you again for joining us today, for the attention and the care that you brought to this presentation and that you bring to your work every single day. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of the symposium.